I made my way around the residence in pitch black conditions to check for any signs of activity inside or outside the house. Fortunately, I caught sight of the edge of a steep ramp as I navigated the yard, just keeping me from tripping over it. I followed the ramp to its top with my mag light, which illuminated two enormous doors built into the south edge of the house. I looked upon them briefly, wondering why anyone would need doors that big for a residence. I then continued exploring around the house for any sign of light through the windows. Little did I know that I was about to find out the reason for the gigantic doors. When you slice a pie on a darkened doorway, your brain is a supercomputer running through every possible threat in the room or unknown area ahead. Gun, knife, ambush. You're prepared for the violence. You're prepared for the tragedy. But what happens when you round that corner and what's staring back at you is so impossible? Your first instinct isn't to shoot. It's to wonder if you finally lost your mind. After two heavy episodes of life and death, today's episode is going into the grave for a call that left me baffled and made a deputy nearly jump out of his skin. The call came in as a welfare check, where someone hadn't been heard from in several days, and family was concerned about their well-being. EMS responded and arrived just after I did, as well as a sheriff's deputy. EMS said they'd never been to the residence before, so they were unfamiliar with the patient or who might live there. It was the middle of summer, and the air was thick and heavy. I made my way up the long handicap-accessible ramp, knocked on the front door several times, but received no reply. There wasn't a gap in the curtain behind the locked door's narrow window, and if I'd knocked any harder, I felt like it was going to fall out. I told EMS to hang tight by the front door while I made my way around the house perimeter. The deputy said he'd go the opposite way to look for any sign of movement on the other side of the residence. I encountered the ramp I mentioned, and my mind began to race regarding what would need a door that size. It appeared to be locked from the inside, with no outer access. There were no windows on that end of the residence either. A bug zapper in the distance claimed a victim, but otherwise it was dead quiet. No vehicles, no voices, no crickets, nothing. As I crept around the back side of the house, listening intently and looking for any form of light coming from inside, I could have sworn I heard a thump, thump inside the house. I stopped cold in my tracks, placed my ear to the side of the residence. A few seconds later, again, thump, thump. What the hell? I muttered. The loudness of the thumps only gave me more unanswered questions. The wheelchair ramp in front was obvious in its purpose, but the steep ramp I had just passed would need something with a few horsepower to make it up and through those doors, which were huge. I've seen a lot of things in the gray, but I hadn't yet encountered a homeowner who kept a pet Sasquatch. Finally found a window with the curtain slightly askew and saw a flicker of light from a TV inside. The area looked to be in the same direction as the thumping was coming from, so this was about to get interesting. I encountered the deputy as he rounded the corner walking back towards me, and I told him what I had seen and heard. We made our way back to the front door where EMS was staged and waiting for us. I called dispatch and advised them of the situation, and that there did appear to be a light on the inside that coincided with some unexplained noises. I didn't know if anyone was making noise to signal for help, or if whatever used those doors was lurking about. I kept that second part to myself, though. A supervisor gave me permission to force my way into the house. I popped the window that was spared from falling out earlier and made entry into the residence. The smell was overwhelming. Not a dead body smell that, once you smell it, you can never forget, but a combination of animal feces, cat urine, garbage, and something else I couldn't identify yet. I entered what appeared to be the kitchen and announced, "State Police, can anyone hear me?" No reply. Once again, I announced, and I received silence in return. Just then, thump, It was just around the corner ahead of me in the area where the flickering light was originating. The deputy was a few steps behind me as I held out my hand in a stop motion. I listened for a couple of seconds and announced, "If anyone can hear me, tell me now." Silence. As I navigated the room, my maglite beam swept over the floor and illuminated a series of, well, let's call them landmines. And they weren't just piles. They were topographical features. Huge mounds of evidence that suggested whatever was in the next room had a very high fiber diet and zero respect for the linoleum. Hopefully it wasn't Cujo. As I glanced back at the deputy to tell him to watch his step, it was too late. He had given in to the smell and pulled his t-shirt up from behind his vest and over his nose, just as he encountered a large, smelly pile with his brand new boots. We were basically engaging in a real-life, the floor is lava, while trying to figure out what was making the noise. I unholstered my Glock with my right hand, slid my maglite into the loop on my belt with my left. I utilized the gun light attachment to clear the next room. It was a welfare check, but too many strange things were happening, and I didn't want to be caught off guard. Someone or something was in the next room, and whichever it may be, it was not responding to any of my commands. I signaled to the deputy to hold his position. I began to slice the pie on the doorway, a technique they beat into your head at the academy for clearing corners safely. But the academy never had a simulator for this. Started towards the end of the wall and noticed the reflection of the TV in the glass of a living room cabinet. I began to see the edge of a bed. Without warning, a gigantic head popped around the corner and met me eye to eye. A 7-foot-tall, 1,200-pound freaking horse was standing in the living room. I stepped back suddenly and lowered my weapon, trying to process what I'd just seen. The deputy walked up to me and looked at my expression and wanted a reason. I just pointed towards the corner of the wall. He started to bring up his duty weapon, and I placed my hand on his arms, lowered them towards the ground, and gave him a motion with my head of, "Just look." Puzzled, he slowly walked to the corner. As he peered around, he got the same unexpected stare down from the horse and let out a "Ah!" and jumped back. I looked at him with a "See?" expression and stepped further away from the wall to get a better look into the next room. I saw the rest of the bed in the middle of the living room floor. Since I now knew what was making the thumping noises, I swapped my Glock for my maglite again. I shined it into the room. I saw what appeared to be a female lying on the bed with just a sheet over her. I tried to get a verbal response as I began to approach her, but the horse wanted to intervene in between us. I noticed that the horse had reins dangling from his head, so I grabbed him and pulled him into the kitchen, and handed him over to the deputy, whose eyes were still huge with disbelief. I walked over to the woman and checked her for a pulse, which I found, but it was very faint. She was alive, but she was in bad shape. I told EMS it was clear, and I knew they'd entered the house by the sounds of the gagging. One of the men came in and began assessing the patient, trying to administer oxygen while dry heaving. I didn't have a weak stomach, but it was all I could do not to join in. As the second EMT brought their stretcher through the landmine obstacle course, the horse became uneasy and just added to the issues at hand. It was clear he was confused, but he also seemed to be concerned about his human and if she was okay. The patient's weight was likely in the 600-pound range. The EMS workers said we needed to move her from the bed to the stretcher, so they suggested we use the sheet that was under her, and each of us grab a corner to slide her. Well, the sheet ripped and nixed that idea, so the ambulance driver hurried out to retrieve a slide board from the unit. While waiting for his return, I noticed the huge doors at the end of the room and knew exactly what their purpose was now. I had to just shake my head. The ambulance driver cautiously ran back in, looking for the horse upon re-entry. We gloved up and planned a strategy to lift the patient enough to get her onto the slide board. The woman was only covered with a sheet, and it slid off as we lifted her, exposing, well, roaches and other things climbing from beneath her and from some of the folds of her skin. One of the EMTs stifled a gag, and the deputy dry heaved. It put me in the mind of the Ipecac episode of Family Guy, because if one of them had gone through with it, the rest of us would have surely followed suit. We finally got her loaded up onto the stretcher and began navigating the huge piles Mr. Ed had left us between the bed and the front door. He even nipped at the ambulance driver's neck as he pushed the stretcher out, which was a task in itself. We got the door shut before the horse followed us out. The next task was getting the stretcher down the wheelchair ramp. The uneven weight was causing the bed to lean from one side to the other, and the narrow wheels were digging into the plywood that was used to make the ramp. EMS, the deputy, and I barely got it to the bottom of the ramp before the frame bent to the point where we didn't think we were going to be able to get it back in the ambulance. Once we did, we got it locked back into place, and the rest was, well, beyond the area of my expertise. So I shut the back of the ambulance doors, gave them a pat just to make sure they were shut, just like on TV. The ambulance headed out for the ER as I gave dispatch the rundown on the radio. After I let off the mic button, I was quickly returned to the eerie quiet that allowed me to reflect for a moment and say a quick prayer for the lady. I was eventually interrupted by thump, thump at the front door of the house, which reminded me to have dispatch get someone come and tend to the horse that likely had been without food and water, and of course probably would like some fresh air to do his business outside. Speaking of which, I scraped the bottom of my boots on the grass for a good 10 minutes while I tried to process everything, and I realized that in the gray, sometimes the why is simply that someone wanted a 7-foot-tall, 1,200-pound roommate for some company. I felt like I was in The Water Boy, and Steve the donkey was roaming around the house. On a side note, welfare checks make up a significant portion of police activity. In some jurisdictions, checking the welfare calls can account for 25 to 30% of total police dispatches. Although this was a very serious situation involving a health crisis, the patient thankfully made a full recovery, and the horse was cared for by a family member while she was on the mend. The gray is present in every call you answer as a police officer and first responder. Despite pitch-black settings on a late-night call or a traffic stop on a bright sunny day that calls for sunglasses, unmirrored of course, I always manage to settle into the gray middle space to look for the answers, or the why. In the time we spend responding to any given call, the thoughts and endless possibilities that flood each of our minds are abruptly met with the reality of the situation once that driver's side door pops open. Most of the time it was what you kind of sort of expected, so to speak. But the other times it was anything but. This was one of those times. Thank you for tuning in to episode 3 of Into the Gray with DK Hall.